later work.
One analogy that's been drawn a great deal is with psychoanalysis, in the following sense, that Wittgenstein is saying that we first of all become, as it were, knotted up in our view of some particular aspect of reality by a false use of language, and that the task of philosophy is to untie these knots. And this, so to speak, therapeutic aspect of philosophical activity has often been said to be very like what Freud thought the psychoanalyst was doing in another direction. Do you think that a similarity exists there?
Yes, I think there certainly is a similarity in that Wittgenstein's abstention from theory in his later philosophy is just like the Freudian analyst's abstention from saying what's wrong with you is you're madly in love with your mother, which doesn't produce any effect at all. The procedure has to be much more circuitous in that the person has to be brought by reliving a whole lot of past experiences, by being reminded of all sorts of thoughts and feelings he's had, that his emotions have a certain peculiar structure, so that something is eventually brought up out of the unconscious. In Wittgenstein's case, what is hidden isn't hidden in quite the same way. What has to be made evident to the philosophically confused or perplexed person is the way, the rules of the language games that people actually use. What has happened to him is he's, on the basis of an analogy he's seen between the way words work in one game and the way they worked in another, he applies the rules of the first game to the second one and gets into a fix. Thinks that because in a shop I say, that's a bicycle, that's a television set, that's a so-and-so, I'm doing something just analogous to that when I look within myself and say, I have an acute pain in my left knee, a pronounced desire for a cup of tea, and a wish that it was Friday. He wants to say these are two utterly different operations, yes, that one's not yes, just listing off things that one finds within oneself in self-description. And the way to do this, he maintains, is to consider language in its natural setting, to see all the circumstances in which people say things, the behavior that characteristically accompanies their saying certain things.
Can I now bring you back to the question of what the influence of this philosophy has been, especially outside philosophy?
I fail to take up that question, you're quite right. The influence of it has been, I suppose, to encourage a certain kind of relativism, because the abstention from theory means, and is connected with, a recognition, so to speak, of the equal rights of all language games, provided that it passes the test of workability as a social instrument of communication. Then it constitutes what he calls a form of life, and he doesn't think you can really understand some, as it were, unfamiliar language game without actually participating, without playing it, so to speak. Well, now, you spoke of influence of this on anthropology and sociology. All right, a certain form of anthropology and sociology, if you like, looks at social orders utterly different from those in which the student of the subject himself lives, and he then proceeds to criticize what's going on there in the light of the accepted rules of his own society, when the whole notion, as it were, of the savage, where people say, well, presumably savage languages, because their life is so technologically unadvanced, their language is presumably going to be a few grunts, whereas, of course, this is not true at all. The languages of technically primitive people are of an enormous degree of complexity. And then one sees, I don't know, rules of taboo, or rules that we call taboo, which is already a somewhat derogatory phrase, because it suggests this is a rule which is based on false assumptions of what connects with what. And he would say, I think that's just a misunderstanding bred by not actually being a party to, not fully being within the form of life in which these taboo rules operate.
What, speaking for yourself, do you think is wrong with this later philosophy, unless, of course, you buy it whole?
No, I certainly don't buy it whole. What I think is important about it, I do think the philosophy of mind, the account of our discourse about our own mental life and that of others, has given very good reason for abandoning an assumption that was traditionally made, that there was a kind of huge cleavage between our thought and discourse about the physical world and our thought and discourse about the mind. It did bring to light that a great deal of what we have to say about our own and other people's mental lives is essentially tied to behavior. As it were, being generous, the test of whether a person is generous is what they give and when, not whether they have generous impulses. A person who claims to have endless generous impulses but actually always lets the plate pass by, one supposes he's either being insincere or is at best deceiving himself. Well, the generous impulse, as it were, Wittgenstein's point, is neither here nor there. It's just for a person to be generous is for them to act in a certain way in certain circumstances. And yet, after all, generosity is a character trait. It's an aspect of an individual's mind. The mind isn't a hidden, private thing altogether. And that, I think, is important in the later work. What I object to myself is the abstention from theory, if you like, that nothing ever seems to come to an end, nothing ever gets settled. The examples are heaped up, and then, as it were, they're offered to you to take or to leave. It seems to me an intellectually unsatisfactory practice. The whole manner of exposition of the investigations is a sort of kind of cumulative and disorderly persuasion rather than definitely setting out something that is to be discussed and saying, well, in favour of it so-and-so is to be said, against it so-and-so is to be said. I don't say this is in any sense a mannerism on Wittgenstein's part. It represents a commitment, a belief on his part that this is the way the subject should be done. I just don't believe it can be done like that, or that understanding of a lasting kind is achieved by this consciously inconclusive way of proceeding.
If one takes 3 paces back and looks at the 2 philosophies of Wittgenstein, the earlier and the later one, there seem to me to be at least 3 ways in which they are viewed by other philosophers who are themselves very distinguished. I suppose a large number of philosophers, perhaps most, regard both the early and the late philosophy as being works of genius. But some, Bertrand Russell as an example, regarded the first philosophy as being the product of genius, but the later philosophy as being trivial and, well, really, he kept saying, he thought, a worthless exercise. There are other philosophers, and Karl Popper is one, for example, who doesn't think at all highly of either of them. How do you evaluate them in their relation to each other?
Well, I'm perhaps docile enough to be quite convinced that Wittgenstein is a genius and that both stages of his work are works of genius. But as so often in philosophical works, this isn't because everything is said in them is true. Who would deny, after all, that Plato was a genius? Yet who would believe Plato's view of the universe, that what really exists is abstract, timeless entities, and the world of things in space and time is a sort of shadowy appearance? One could recognize the genius of a philosopher without, in fact, accepting very much of what he says. The genius might consist, one might say, very evidently in the case of Kant, in asking questions of a more fundamental and powerful kind than people had asked before, challenging assumptions that had gone hitherto unchallenged. And I think in both parts of his work, this is achieved.
Thank you very much. I must say that I think that you've succeeded in doing something that is very difficult to do, and that is making 2 philosophies intelligible in a space that in this series we're normally devoting to one. Thank you very much, Anthony Quinton.